For 3 decades, one warning echoed through every classified briefing room in Washington. Do not start a war with Iran. It did not matter which administration was in power. It did not matter which general was sitting at the head of the table or which defense secretary was presenting the assessment. The conclusion was always identical. Every serious military mind that studied the problem reached the same place. Iran is not a target you can hit and walk away from. The country is 4 times the geographic size of Iraq. Its population exceeds 90 million people. Its terrain, mountain ranges, desert plateaus, dispersed cities, was specifically described by military planners as a defender's paradise and an attacker's nightmare. And sitting at its southern edge is the single most critical energy choke point on the planet. For 30 years, that assessment held. Presidents came and went. Pressure mounted and receded. But the military's position never moved. Then something changed. Not the intelligence, not the geography, not Iran's capabilities. What changed was the willingness to listen, and the consequences of that shift are now playing out in real time. Not just across the Middle East, but in the fuel prices, supply chains, and household budgets of people living on every continent on Earth. To understand how we arrived at this moment, you have to understand the decades-long campaign that preceded it. According to multiple reports and testimony from former senior U.S. officials, there was sustained, organized, and heavily funded pressure applied over many years to push the United States toward direct military confrontation with Iran. The argument that was repeatedly presented to policymakers was built on a single premise. The Iranian government is structurally weak. A sufficiently forceful strike at its leadership and nuclear infrastructure would cause the regime to collapse from within. A new government, one aligned with Western interests, would rise from the ruins. The U.S. military never accepted this argument, not because the institution was reluctant to use force, but because the analysts and strategists who had actually run the numbers did not believe it. The Pentagon conducted repeated simulation exercises modeling a conflict with Iran, and across every scenario, the conclusion was the same. You can bomb Iran. You can hit every nuclear site on the map. You can reduce government buildings in Tehran to rubble. And when the smoke clears, you are still facing a country of 90 million people, spread across terrain that makes Afghanistan look manageable, with an arsenal of ballistic missiles capable of igniting the entire Gulf region simultaneously. That was the professional military judgment. Consistent, documented, ignored. Now here is where the strategic picture becomes genuinely alarming, and where most mainstream coverage has failed to explain what is actually happening. When the conflict began, Washington's assumption was straightforward. Iran would retaliate by going after what the United States military is built to defend: carrier strike groups, forward air bases, hardened military installations. The kind of targets that American forces have spent decades preparing to protect. Iran did not do that. According to military analysts and defense officials who have spoken publicly and on background, Iran made a deliberate strategic choice. Rather than engaging American military assets directly, assets that are well defended and whose loss the United States can absorb, Iran went after something far more vulnerable and far more consequential: the money. Energy infrastructure across the Gulf became the primary target. Oil terminals, refinery complexes, loading platforms, pipeline junctions, and perhaps most devastatingly, desalination plants. The facilities that produce the drinking water that entire nations depend on for basic survival. These are not hardened military targets. They are sprawling, exposed, and distributed across hundreds of kilometers of coastline. Defending all of them simultaneously is not a realistic military objective. At the center of this strategy sits the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway, at its tightest point barely 33 kilometers wide, through which approximately 20% of the world's entire oil supply passes every single day. Iran controls the northern coastline, and according to naval analysts, Iran possesses the capability to mine the strait, deploy swarms of fast attack vessels, and launch anti-ship missiles from concealed coastal positions that would make keeping the waterway open extraordinarily costly for any naval force attempting to do so. Reports indicate that Iran moved rapidly to threaten this choke point, not by sealing it completely, or at least not immediately, but by making transit through it dangerous and unpredictable enough that insurance premiums for oil tankers spiked dramatically, and major shipping companies began rerouting their vessels. The effect was nearly immediate. Global oil prices surged before any full closure had even occurred. The strategic logic behind this approach, as defense analysts have explained it, is elegant in its simplicity. Iran does not need to defeat the United States in a conventional military engagement to achieve its objectives. It simply needs to sustain enough pressure on the global energy supply for long enough that the economic and political pain in Washington becomes unbearable. This leads directly to what several prominent strategists have described as the most dangerous feature of the current situation: the escalation trap. The dominant military theory in Washington is built around the concept of escalation dominance. The belief that the United States can always go one step higher than any adversary, that the sheer scale of American military power means any opponent will eventually back down rather than face the full consequences of continued confrontation. In theory, this logic is sound. The United States operates the most powerful conventional military force in human history. In practice, history offers a consistent and uncomfortable rebuttal. Air campaigns, regardless of their scale or precision, have never, not once, produced regime change on their own. Consider what the United States actually did during the Second World War. On a single night in March 1945, American bombers struck Tokyo with incendiary weapons, killing more people in one evening than died at either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Over the following 5 months, American forces systematically bombed every major Japanese city. Japan did not surrender. It took 2 atomic weapons, the Soviet entry into the Pacific War, and the combined weight of total national collapse before the Japanese government finally agreed to terms. In Korea, the United States reduced virtually every significant structure in North Korea to rubble from the air. The population endured destruction on a scale that remains almost incomprehensible today. The government did not fall. In Vietnam, the United States dropped a greater tonnage of ordnance than it used across the entire Second World War combined. The government did not fall. In every single case without exception, sustained aerial bombardment caused populations to consolidate around their governments, rather than turn against them. The historical pattern is not ambiguous. Bombing a country into political submission through air power alone does not work. It has never worked. And there is no credible analytical basis for believing it would work against a country that is larger, more geographically dispersed, and more ideologically unified than any of the historical examples above. This is the trap that experienced strategists warned about before the current conflict began. You initiate airstrikes because you believe the campaign will be short, decisive, and clean. When it is not, you intensify. When intensification does not produce results, you escalate further. And each step up that ladder brings new consequences that then create political pressure to take the next step. The cascading logic, as analysts have mapped it out, runs approximately like this. If the United States or its partners strike Iranian energy infrastructure, Iran retaliates against Gulf energy infrastructure. If Iranian desalination facilities are targeted, Iran responds by hitting desalination plants in Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and potentially other neighboring states. Several of these nations rely on desalinated water for the overwhelming majority of their fresh water supply. Destroying those plants does not simply cause economic disruption. It creates a humanitarian emergency within days, which brings us to the global economic dimension. And this is where the consequences extend beyond the Middle East and into the daily lives of ordinary people everywhere on Earth. Oil is not simply fuel for automobiles. It is the foundational input for industrial production, electricity generation, agricultural operations, chemical manufacturing, and virtually every supply chain that exists in the modern global economy. When oil supply is disrupted at the scale represented by the Persian Gulf, the effects do not remain contained within one region. They cascade outward, compounding as they travel through interconnected global systems. Europe faces acute vulnerability. Following the conflict in Ukraine, European nations lost access to inexpensive Russian energy and shifted their dependency toward Middle Eastern and American sources. A significant disruption to Gulf supply layered on top of that existing Russian shortfall would push several European economies, many of which are already barely growing, toward genuine crisis. Energy prices would spike, industrial output would contract, inflation, which has only recently been brought partially under control, would accelerate again. Japan and South Korea face an even more exposed position. Both nations are heavily reliant on Gulf oil imports and hold limited strategic reserves relative to their consumption rates. A sustained disruption would begin hitting their economies within weeks. The consequences for developing nations would be proportionally even more severe. Countries across Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, nations already managing fragile economic conditions with limited reserves, would be hit by energy price shocks they have no capacity to absorb. Several economists have used a word in their assessments that is deliberately chosen for its precision. Not recession, depression. It is worth emphasizing that this represents a worst-case scenario rather than a certainty. But the fact that credible, serious economists are modeling this possibility at all tells you something important about the actual risk profile of the current situation. There is another dimension that has not received adequate coverage in mainstream reporting, and it concerns the role of Russia and China. Both governments have significant strategic incentives to see the United States become deeply entangled in a prolonged Middle Eastern conflict. This is not speculation about hidden intentions. It is basic strategic reasoning that officials from both countries have articulated in various forms over the past decade. An America that is operationally pinned down in the Middle East, consuming military resources, absorbing domestic political pressure from an unpopular war, and redirecting its strategic attention away from other theaters, is an America with substantially less bandwidth to focus on the Indo-Pacific region or Eastern Europe. According to intelligence assessments reported by Western media organizations, Russia has been providing meaningful support to Iran in the form of satellite imagery, electronic signals intelligence, and real-time information about the positioning and movement of American and allied military assets. This is, not coincidentally, precisely what the United States has been providing to Ukraine in its conflict with Russia. The strategic symmetry is deliberate and clearly understood by everyone involved. China's role, according to analysts, has been more focused on technology transfers. Reports surfaced prior to the current escalation that China had supplied advanced air defense systems and long-range radar equipment capable of tracking stealth aircraft. If accurate, this would significantly complicate American air operations and diminish the effectiveness of what has historically been the U.S. military's most decisive advantage: the ability to strike with effective impunity from the air. What makes this dynamic particularly significant for long-term American strategic planning is the direction of travel. Russian and Chinese support for Iran is, according to multiple analysts, more likely to increase as the conflict continues than to diminish. Both governments view the current situation as an opportunity to accelerate the transition toward a multipolar international order. A meaningful American setback in the Middle East would, in their calculation, fundamentally alter how every nation on Earth evaluates the reliability and value of American security commitments. Which leads to what may be the most consequential piece of this entire strategic puzzle. What is happening with the Gulf states? For decades, the security structure of the Persian Gulf rested on a single foundational premise. The United States would protect Gulf nations from Iranian aggression. American military bases, naval assets, and missile defense systems stationed across the Gulf served as a visible guarantee that Iran could not threaten its neighbors without immediately confronting American military power. According to multiple diplomatic sources, that premise is now being questioned more seriously than at any point in the modern history of the region. Gulf states were not consulted before the current escalation began. They did not participate in the decision-making process, and they are now absorbing the consequences of a conflict they did not choose in the form of Iranian strikes on infrastructure their populations depend on for survival. Several Gulf nations had already begun hedging their strategic bets before the current conflict. Saudi Arabia's deepening security relationship with Pakistan, which reportedly includes a nuclear component, is one visible indicator. Growing interest from additional regional powers in similar arrangements is another. These are not the diplomatic signals of governments that feel confident in the durability of American protection. These are the signals of governments that are actively looking for alternatives. The fundamental question that Gulf leaders are now reportedly grappling with internally is stark. Are American military bases on their soil assets or liabilities? Before the current conflict, the answer seemed self-evident. Today, according to diplomatic observers, it is genuinely contested. The very installations that were supposed to deter Iranian aggression have instead made Gulf nations targets for retaliation. All of this returns us to the question that sits at the center of the entire situation. How does this end? According to virtually every serious strategic analyst who has commented publicly on the conflict, there is no clear diplomatic off-ramp currently visible. The political framing in Washington centers on objectives: regime change, unconditional surrender, decisive military victory, that almost entirely ignore the fundamental reality that Iran must agree to any negotiated resolution. And Iran, based on all available evidence, has no incentive to accept terms that do not address its core requirements. Analysts generally point to three primary Iranian demands that would need to be satisfied in any genuine settlement. First, comprehensive removal of economic sanctions, which have severely damaged the Iranian economy over many years, and which no Iranian government could accept leaving in place and survive politically. Second, credible security guarantees against future military action. Given that Iran has been struck multiple times within a short period, any agreement that does not include serious assurances against repetition would be rejected. Third, some form of economic compensation, whether through direct transfers or the release of frozen assets. The political difficulty for Washington is painfully obvious. Meeting these demands would be characterized domestically as concession, and no American president operating within an electoral cycle wants to be publicly associated with concession to Iran. But the alternative, continuing a conflict that is pushing the global economy toward crisis, straining alliances, drawing in great power competitors, and demonstrating the practical limits of American military power, carries its own escalating political and strategic costs. Several analysts have drawn a comparison that is historically uncomfortable but analytically appropriate. In the final years of the Vietnam War, senior American officials understood privately that the conflict could not be won. They continued the war anyway because no one in the chain of command wanted to be the person who made the decision to stop. The cost of that political paralysis was measured in years of additional destruction and tens of thousands of additional lives. There is one further dimension that deserves serious attention: what the current conflict is doing to nuclear proliferation dynamics across the Middle East. If Iran emerges from this confrontation more committed to pursuing nuclear weapons capability, and multiple experts assess this as now the most probable outcome, it would set off a chain reaction of proliferation pressure across the region. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt are all nations that have historically relied on American security guarantees and that face enormous domestic political pressure to consider independent deterrence options if that reliance becomes untenable. The strategic irony that analysts repeatedly return to is striking in its dimensions. The conflict that was explicitly justified as a means of preventing Iran from becoming a nuclear power may ultimately make that outcome more likely, and may extend nuclear ambitions to several additional regional actors simultaneously. What is unfolding is not simply a military conflict between two parties. It is, according to the analysts, strategists, economists, and former officials who have studied it most carefully, a potential inflection point in the structure of the global order itself. The outcome will determine not only territorial and political questions in the Middle East, but whether the broader security architecture that has organized international relations for the past several decades can withstand the pressures now being applied to it. The economic consequences are already visible. Energy prices are rising, supply chains are registering stress, financial markets are pricing in a level of geopolitical uncertainty that has not been seen in a generation. And every week that passes without a diplomatic resolution, the costs compound. There are no simple answers embedded in this situation. There may not be any good answers. But understanding the strategic dynamics, the historical patterns, and the economic stakes at play is the foundation for making any sense of what may prove to be the defining geopolitical crisis of this era. The question is not whether the situation is dangerous. Every serious analyst agrees that it is. The question is whether the people who hold the decision-making power fully understand the depth of that danger. Based on the evidence available, that remains an open and deeply troubling question. One more dimension deserves attention before we close, and it is something that gets discussed among defense specialists but rarely surfaces in general coverage. It concerns the mathematics of missile defense. The United States and its partners operate some of the most advanced defensive systems ever built. Systems with names and reputations that carry significant symbolic weight. On paper, they represent formidable protection. In practice, according to defense analysts, they face a structural problem that no amount of technological sophistication resolves. Defensive interceptors are expensive. The weapons being used to overwhelm them are not. Each interceptor costs anywhere from several $100,000 to several $1 million, depending on the system. Many of the drones and shorter-range missiles being used against them cost a small fraction of that figure. And, critically, interceptors are finite. Once a stockpile is depleted, it cannot be replenished quickly. These systems take months, sometimes years, to manufacture. Production cannot be meaningfully accelerated in the time frame of an active conflict. Iran possesses one of the largest ballistic missile and drone arsenals in the region. Thousands of short-range systems, hundreds of medium and long-range missiles, and an enormous drone inventory that can be produced continuously at relatively low cost. The arithmetic is brutal and straightforward. If enough projectiles are launched in sustained, distributed waves over time, defensive stockpiles deplete. And once they are depleted, everything behind them is exposed. This is a structural vulnerability that Iran appears to understand clearly and is reportedly exploiting deliberately, not by attempting to overwhelm defenses in a single massive strike, but by applying consistent pressure across multiple targets over an extended period, designed specifically to exhaust defensive capacity gradually. Military historians have a name for the underlying dynamic: the defender's dilemma. When you must defend everything simultaneously, you cannot defend anything effectively. You cannot position enough defensive capability in enough places at once. The attacker, who only needs some strikes to penetrate rather than all of them, holds a fundamental geometric advantage. This is why multiple former senior military officials have described the current strategic position as structurally unsustainable, not because American forces lack individual capability, but because the nature of the conflict systematically favors the attacking side in ways that technology cannot fully offset. And this connects to a broader strategic concern: what the conflict is doing to American global capacity. The United States maintains military commitments across every major region of the world. It has foundational obligations to NATO in Europe. It maintains a substantial security presence in the Indo-Pacific in response to growing Chinese military capabilities. Every ship deployed to the Gulf is a ship not available in the South China Sea. Every interceptor transferred to partners in the Middle East is one not positioned in South Korea or Japan. This is, according to several analysts, precisely the scenario that American strategic competitors have been hoping to create. A United States stretched across too many simultaneous commitments, consuming expensive precision munitions in a conflict that produces no clear strategic gain, while competitors use the window of distraction to advance their own positions in other theaters. Historians have a term for this pattern as well: Imperial overstretch. It has been studied across centuries of geopolitical history, from the late Roman Empire to the British Empire at the height of its global reach, to the Soviet Union's experience in Afghanistan. The pattern is remarkably consistent. Great powers do not typically decline because of a single catastrophic defeat. They decline because they commit resources to conflicts that drain their strength over time without producing strategic returns that justify the investment. Whether the current situation will be recorded as a turning point in American global leadership or simply as a costly chapter in an ongoing story is not yet determined. But the structural dynamics that serious analysts are identifying bear uncomfortable similarities to historical patterns that did not end favorably for the power at their center. What distinguishes this moment from previous American military engagements, according to geopolitical analysts, is the speed at which economic consequences are appearing. In Vietnam, the financial costs accumulated across years. In Iraq and Afghanistan, the burden built across 2 decades. In the current conflict, the economic disruption was almost immediate because of how central Gulf energy is to the functioning of the global economy. Markets have already adjusted their pricing to reflect significant disruption. But several economists have noted that current market pricing likely underestimates actual risk because the models being used assume a relatively brief conflict. If the situation becomes protracted, if the Strait of Hormuz remains restricted for months rather than weeks, the economic models enter territory that has no meaningful modern precedent. The last disruption to global energy supply of comparable strategic significance was the 1973 oil embargo. That event triggered a worldwide recession, fundamentally reshaped international politics, and permanently altered the relationship between energy-producing and energy-consuming nations. And that disruption involved a substantially smaller share of global supply than what is currently at risk. The situation sits, in the assessment of the analysts and former officials who have studied it most carefully, balanced on a knife's edge. There are paths toward diplomatic resolution that would prevent the worst economic and humanitarian consequences from materializing. Those paths are narrow and require political decisions that are genuinely difficult to make. There are also paths toward continued escalation, mounting costs, and the kind of generational strategic damage that reshapes the international order. Which path is taken will depend on decisions that are being made right now by people operating under enormous pressure with imperfect information in a situation that has already moved beyond anything the models originally predicted. The stakes extend far beyond the Middle East. They extend to every economy, every government, and every household on Earth that depends on the stability of a global system that is currently under more strain than it has experienced in decades. That is the situation as it stands, and understanding it clearly is the first and most essential step.